"Your name?" the judge asked coldly. The ragged man stood silent, his sunken eyes fixed on the floor. Whispers filled the courtroom. "Another junkie. Just a burden on society." The judge flipped through his file, then suddenly froze. The entire room fell into complete silence. Standing before them wasn't a homeless drifter. He was a war hero who had sacrificed everything for his country. Do you think they still dared to look down on him? Type respect to speak up. Daniel Rhodes was a 71-year-old veteran who had served with distinction in Iraq and Afghanistan. His military record included multiple commendations, but his body and mind carried the permanent scars of a roadside bombing that had claimed the lives of 3 men under his command. After his discharge, Daniel had tried desperately to reintegrate into civilian life. He found work as a security guard, rented a modest apartment, and even volunteered at the local VA hospital on weekends. But the invisible wounds of war, the PTSD that woke him screaming most nights, made maintaining steady employment nearly impossible. The nightmares grew worse. The medications dulled his mind but couldn't quiet the memories. The flashbacks came without warning, triggered by a car backfiring or a child's sudden cry. Employers grew impatient with his unexpected absences and startled reactions. "We appreciate your service," they would say when letting him go, "but we need someone more reliable." After years of unemployment, his savings depleted, and medical bills mounting, Daniel lost his apartment. His few possessions, military medals, photographs, and a change of clothes fit into a weathered backpack that became his constant companion as he navigated life on the streets. On a particularly bitter winter night, when temperatures dropped well below freezing and the city's shelters had reached capacity, Daniel sought refuge under the overhang of an abandoned building. He wasn't looking to cause trouble, just to survive until morning. The building's security guard discovered him around midnight, huddled in the doorway. Without asking questions or offering alternatives, he called the police, reporting trespassing by a homeless person. When officers arrived, Daniel offered no resistance. He simply stood, clutching his backpack tightly, his weary eyes reflecting decades of struggle. The officers noted his military jacket but made no inquiries about his service. They processed him like any other vagrant, another statistic in their nightly reports. At the police station, Daniel silently signed the paperwork they placed before him. He declined to call an attorney, not because he didn't understand his rights, but because experience had taught him that his words carried little weight. When asked if he had any questions, he simply shook his head. 3 days later, Daniel appeared for his court hearing. His appearance had deteriorated further during his brief detention. His military jacket, once a source of pride, hung loosely on his thin frame. His shoes were coming apart at the seams. His silver gray hair, usually kept neat despite his circumstances, was disheveled and unwashed. As he entered the courtroom, whispers rippled through the gallery. "Another drunk disturbing the peace. These people are everywhere now. Why don't they just get a job?" The court-appointed attorney beside him barely glanced up from his phone. They had spoken for less than 5 minutes before the hearing. Not enough time for Daniel to explain about the medals in his backpack or the shrapnel still lodged near his spine. Daniel stood before the bench, eyes downcast, shoulders slumped, not in shame, but in resignation. There was no anger in his expression, no self-pity, only the quiet acceptance of a man who had grown accustomed to being invisible despite once having been deemed a hero. Judge Eleanor Mayers adjusted her glasses and looked down at the defendant with the practiced detachment of someone who had seen countless similar cases. To her, at this moment, Daniel Rhodes was just another name on her docket, another homeless person to process before lunch. Case number 47,823, Commonwealth versus Daniel Rhodes, charged with criminal trespassing, called the court clerk, his voice echoing through the suddenly quiet room. The prosecutor read the charges in a monotone voice that suggested he'd recited similar words dozens of times that morning alone. Defendant Daniel Rhodes, charged with unlawful trespassing on private property. The Commonwealth recommends administrative penalties and 6 months probation. The court-appointed defender rose half-heartedly, his defense as perfunctory as his introduction had been. "Your Honor, my client is homeless with no prior record. He was simply seeking shelter from potentially life-threatening weather conditions. We request leniency given the circumstances." Several spectators in the courtroom exchanged knowing glances. One woman nudged her companion and rolled her eyes. Another man shook his head in disgust, as though the mere presence of a homeless person in their courthouse was an affront to decency. Judge Mayers flipped mechanically through the file before her, barely scanning the documents it contained. "Does the defendant wish to make a statement before sentencing?" she asked, her tone suggesting the question was merely procedural, the answer irrelevant. Daniel looked up, his bloodshot eyes revealing exhaustion, but not a single tear. "I only wanted to survive that night, Your Honor," he said softly, his voice raspy from disuse. Behind him, a couple of court employees exchanged amused glances. One whispered something that made the other snicker. No one bothered to ask why a man who once lived with dignity now had to beg for warmth in the doorways of strangers. No one questioned how a decorated soldier could end up without resources or support in the very country he had risked his life to protect. A child walking past the courtroom with his mother pointed at Daniel. "Why does that man look so sad?" "Mom!" The mother pulled her child's hand, hurrying away without answering. Under the harsh fluorescent lights, a person who had once worn armor to defend his nation's freedom was being treated as nothing more than a nuisance, a problem to be processed and forgotten. A young reporter, new to covering the courts, watched the proceedings with growing discomfort. She noticed how Daniel's hands, calloused and scarred, trembled slightly as he stood before the judge. She saw how he straightened his posture instinctively when addressing the court, a hint of military bearing breaking through his exhaustion. The judge continued reviewing the file, preparing to deliver her routine sentence, when she turned to the final page. Her expression changed subtly as she read a notation that had been added by a clerk. Without looking up, she asked, "Mr. Rhodes, the file indicates you're a veteran, is that correct?" Daniel nodded once. "Yes, Your Honor." "What branch and years of service?" "Army, Your Honor. 17 years, 2 tours in Iraq, 1 in Afghanistan." The prosecutor glanced up from his notes, suddenly paying attention. The defender looked at his client with new interest, as though seeing him for the first time. How many silent heroes walk among us, unrecognized and forgotten? How many men and women who sacrificed everything now live on the margins of the very society they swore to protect? How many veterans sleep on our cold streets tonight, carrying both physical and emotional scars while we pass by without a second glance? If you believe these unsung heroes deserve more respect than anyone else, type respect to honor those who gave everything but asked for nothing in return. As Judge Mayers turned to the final page of Daniel's file, her hand suddenly froze. Her eyes widened as she read the information that had been overlooked during his processing. Bold letters stood out on the page. Bronze Star for exceptional valor in combat, Ramadi Campaign. Purple Heart, wounded in action, National Honor Citation for the rescue of fellow soldiers in 2007. The judge looked up at Daniel, truly seeing him for the first time, recognizing that the stooped, thin man before her had once been a living embodiment of courage under fire. She signaled for the court clerk to pause the proceedings. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted palpably, as though everyone simultaneously felt an electric current run down their spines. The prosecutor whispered, "My God." A veteran sitting in the back row stood up, removed his cap, and offered a crisp military salute. Another person, wearing civilian clothes, followed suit. Within moments, the entire courtroom, lawyers, police officers, bailiffs, spectators, rose spontaneously to their feet, heads bowed in respect toward Daniel Rhodes. No announcement prompted this. No order was given. Respect, delayed, but not diminished. Judge Eleanor rose from her seat, her voice trembling with emotion. "On behalf of this city and all those fortunate enough to live in freedom, I extend to you our deepest apologies." She dismissed all charges immediately and suggested that Daniel be appointed as an honorary advisor to the local Veterans Association. A businessman who had witnessed the proceedings approached afterward, visibly moved. "Mr. Rhodes, I own several apartment buildings. I'd like to offer you a permanent home in one of them. No rent for as long as you need it." Daniel looked bewildered by the sudden change in how people perceived him. The court officer, who had earlier smirked, now held the door open with reverence. The prosecutor, who had casually recommended probation, now offered his card, promising assistance with veteran benefits. Even the security guard who had called the police was waiting outside, shame evident on his face. "Sir, if I had known, my own father served in Vietnam. I should have asked first." Later that afternoon, as Daniel was escorted to his new apartment, a small crowd gathered. Word had spread quickly through veterans groups. Men and women in various stages of military dress lined the sidewalk, standing at attention as he passed. The apartment was modest but clean, a one-bedroom unit with basic furnishings, a stocked refrigerator, and a view of the city park. On the wall hung a professionally framed shadow box, empty, waiting for the medals he carried in his backpack. As Daniel unpacked his few possessions, his hands trembled, not from withdrawal or hunger as they had before, but from overwhelming emotion. The back bedroom had been set up as an office with a computer, printer, and telephone. "The Veterans Association meets twice a month," explained his new landlord. "They've asked if you would consider sharing your experiences. Many younger veterans are struggling with the same demons." That evening, a local news crew arrived for an interview. The reporter approached respectfully, keeping a comfortable distance. "Mr. Rhodes, how does it feel to go from being invisible to being recognized in a single day?" Daniel considered the question carefully, his weather-worn face thoughtful. "Recognition isn't what I ever sought," he replied softly. "But being seen as a human being again, that means everything." When asked if he harbored resentment for the years of neglect, Daniel shook his head. "The true tragedy isn't how I was treated today. It's how many others like me remain unseen on streets across this country." By nightfall, the story had been picked up by national news outlets. Veterans organizations from across the state contacted the local chapter, offering resources and support. Medical professionals volunteered services. Employment specialists reached out with positions adapted for those with PTSD. A community that had walked past Daniel for years suddenly saw him clearly. When asked what message he wanted to share with the world, Daniel smiled gently, his eyes brightening with an unexpected spark of hope. "Don't judge someone's worth until you've heard their story. Every person you pass has fought battles you know nothing about." 1 month later, in the central city park, they erected a small bronze memorial, not elaborate or showy, but dignified in its simplicity. The inscription read simply, "In honor of the unnamed heroes, those who gave us peace but found none for themselves." Daniel still lived modestly in his apartment, taking daily walks to the park where he would sit quietly reading beneath the memorial. Children who once might have avoided him now stopped to listen to his stories, not of war and trauma, but of friendship, courage, and the bonds formed between those who served together. Schools began inviting him to speak about resilience and dignity. Veterans sought his counsel on navigating civilian life. City officials consulted him on improving services for the homeless. The courthouse where he had once stood accused instituted a new protocol. Every defendant was now asked about military service as part of initial processing, ensuring that veterans received appropriate support and resources regardless of their circumstances. When a reporter asked if he regretted sacrificing so much for a country that had forgotten him, Daniel smiled and shook his head. "No. As long as someone remembers, I haven't lost anything at all. The true measure of a society isn't how it treats its most privileged members, but how it honors those who have fallen through the cracks after serving its highest ideals. Some heroes don't need titles or medals. They simply need enough respect to know their sacrifices weren't in vain." Every year on Veterans Day, people gather at the memorial, bringing flowers not just for the granite monuments to famous battles, but for the simple bronze plaque acknowledging those who fought personal wars long after returning home. Daniel is always there, standing tall despite his injuries, a living reminder that it's never too late to see the hero behind the struggle. If you believe people like Daniel deserve to be honored, subscribe to TT Hero Stories. TT Hero Stories, because some heroes never stop serving.